I will start. Look, panel, I'm going to have 3 points in this speech. One, I'm going to talk about how we think that racism by employers and by police officers is actually going to get worse towards these minorities, that opening government is wanting to make their life so much better. Here, we're in direct clash with opening. I will also talk to you about why we think that we need the public to know, to be able to we need the public to be involved and to know who are criminals in order to be able to effectively prevent future crimes. And also, I will talk to you about the victims. Here, we are in direct clash with closing government. I will explain there why we think that it is necessary for these victims to be able to understand and give words to what happened to them in order for them to rehabilitate. As I said, we're in direct clash with both teams, therefore I will flag my rebuttal within my points. So let's talk about why we think that racism is going to actually become worse, and it's going to make it so immensely more hard for people from minorities to be able to go back into society after they've come out of prison, or whether or not they have committed crimes. So opening government says on this that because you can't, after this motion, decide not to take employees because they were victims, it's going to make their lives so much better. Opening opposition says on this, gives a few reasons for why this impact is small, but does not actually argue with this impact. What we're going to explain is why it's the opposite. So in our world, an employer that is interviewing someone for a job can decide whether or not to ask for a criminal record, right? So in that world, we believe that it is, opening opposition says it's likely that in many cases, no, but notice a few things, right? Notice, first of all, that there are specific areas of employment where by law, you have to get a criminal record of someone who you're considering to employ, right? Whether that's children, work with children, whether that's work with people with disabilities, and so on, right? Also notice it's considered legitimate in many countries. You're able to turn to the police and ask for a criminal record without even asking the person for their consent, right? And also notice that there are just some people who look at possible employees, see their skin color, see the number of tattoos that they have on their arms, or see I don't know, or hear their accent or something, and can assume that they might have a criminal background. We think that on our side of the house, if you see that person, you can ask to find out if that person in fact has or doesn't have a criminal background. On government side, you cannot do that anymore. We think that that means that automatically people, to a larger extent, will assume that people seem to be more likely to have a criminal background, and therefore decide not to employ them. Notice this does not necessarily come from being racist, right? This doesn't mean that if a person comes and looks a certain way, then I'll just assume that he's going to commit a crime, like opening government tried to say. This does mean that I'm afraid of crimes being committed next to me, around me, towards people working with me, or towards myself. And therefore, to avoid such a situation, I will try to do everything I can to push away from me anyone who seems like he could be a criminal. We think that once you have the okay of has committed a crime before, it is way more likely that you'll decide not to hire him. If you can't have that okay, it is a lot more likely in a government world that people will decide not to employ those who they assume might have a criminal background. Now, to explain why we think this is also crucial for policing and brutal policing, let's talk about why we think that the public needs to know about what's happening in order for police to do their job in a good way, right? The police is completely dependent on the public being able to know what's happening around it, right? Why is this true? Because the police does its job, and does its job well only when the public tells the police, right? If they make a 911 call and make sure that the police knows about a crime that's happening around them. We think that the public is way more likely to notice what's happening around them, specifically notice certain people as dangerous if they know that they have a criminal background. This is true for neighbors. This is true for friends or faraway family members, right? We think that this means that the police can get way more, on our side of the house, the police can get more precise information about who they should be worried about, right? Why is this important? Because we think that We think that on government side, what the police has to do is assume that whatever call they get, whatever response they get from the public is the worst type of situation that they need to respond to, right? We think that that's a situation in which they have to come in with all their force because they don't know if they're coming to deal with a person who has priors or doesn't. If the person reporting to the police does know that there are priors or that there aren't priors, then the police can respond accordingly. We think that it is fair for the police to respond differently to people with priors and without priors because, as our opening explained, it is very likely that people will go back to, will commit crimes again after they've been in prison. Before I continue, I'll take opening.
One, most businesses in this area are run by people of the same race. Two, you are given economic skills to even qualify for the job in the first place and even get to the interview stage in the first place.
Look, we think that the whole case coming from opening government on how now the public is going to want money to stream towards prisoners is just completely not analyzed, and we don't understand why it has to be done through this motion, right? We think there are other ways to energize people to decide that they want prisoners to have like better terms and so on, right? So and the whole thing about the same race, as we said, this is not about racism. This is about being afraid of crimes that are being done next to you. Let's talk about the victims. Okay, so we think that while you forget. While as a victim, you forget what happened to you, don't forget the feeling of what happened to you, right? Why is this true? Because for a long time, right, the time that the person is in prison, you do have the memory of what happened, right? We think that in this time, you sort of get like automatic responses to different situations, right? The same situation, everything that closing government described that happens to victims is true during the whole time that a person is in prison. We think that after the person comes out, it's very unlikely that a person will just stop behaving that way, right? We think it's become a subconscious response to whatever happens around them. We think that in order to rehabilitate, victims need to be able to understand and give words to what happened to them. We think that only when they can take what happened to them out of the subconscious level and into the conscious level, they can actually respond to it. We think that this is like babies, right? Babies who don't remember what happened to them can be traumatized by what happened to them, even without having a memory, right? We think that this goes with them throughout their lives. It is the same for people whose memories are erased. For those reasons, please oppose.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech and am happy to call upon the government whip. Hear, hear.
Okay, let me just get my headphones. Sorry. Three, two, one. I believe that Georgia wins this debate because he's able to prove two things. A, why the state has a specific duty towards victims and why this is a unique way to help them, going much further than opening government. And second, why on a principle level, it is unfair and unjust to still punish people and give them no material to actually appeal to their punishment and give no rules about how their punishment is gonna be enforced. I'm gonna do like team by team whip speed, but before that, I'm gonna deal with the attacks that we hear in office. And I do believe there are two attacks. One we hear from CEO, and it's basically saying that even if you forget your memory, you don't forget your feeling, that this is important because you need to understand what you're going through, right? A, notice that very often your feelings are created by your memories, right? There is a causal or a relationship here, right? Your memory very often creates the feeling, which means that in the moment you need to stop actually remembering something. It is far more likely that after a while, right, not immediately probably, that like after a short while you will also stop having the feeling. But you notice that very often, even if you see some strange behaviors and you kind of don't know what is going on, right? This is something which is after a time very likely to stop, right? Because you don't have the memory, which means that you don't have a warrant to act in that way. Finally, they say you need to understand this, right? But this is very often, as Georgie pointed out, just knowing what happened to you does not lead to you understanding this. It very often leads to years of depression, very often leads to having trigger warnings all of the time, and very often leads to spending years in therapy, which is very often A, ineffective, B, very often stigmatized, which means that very often people don't even go and take this route, right? And C, like, it's just like very often unavailable to a lot of people. The second attack that we hear is from OO, which they basically claim victims are now not gonna get like retribution, right? A, notice that these people still go to jail presumably, which means that some retribution and some satisfaction in this person going to jail is gonna happen. But as Jordi pointed out, this is never enough for you as a victim, right? You always want more for the person who robbed you and who created you a trauma for the next 5 years, right? Which means that on both sides of the house, retribution happens to some extent, but not to the fullest as the victim would like, right? But see, this is very often, even if you see them going to jail, right, you're still left with trauma and exhaustion from like the justice proceeding, right? Which means that you still have to deal with years of extremely bad stuff. And I do believe this is something which is very important to actually fix. Let's deal with the material that we get from closing garment. And I do believe they have like two things. A, they say like because of like racism, everyone will assume that now you're a criminal if we can. Right? A, it doesn't sell on both sides of the house like racism at the workplace or like at the admissions office at the units exists to a huge extent, right? And I don't think how this is like making any meaningful comparative, right? But you notice that very often in a lot of countries you just cannot ask people from the criminal record, right? Because like very often this is something which is seen as invasion of your privacy, right? In a lot of states in the US, this is the case, which means that their mechanism is outstanding in a lot of countries, right? So you notice that very often we're fine with risking some benefit to people who are like minority member community, but they haven't done any crime, because we do believe that people who went out of jail and who are searching for a job, in order for them to know like reoffend, this is something which is far more important. But finally, this is very often people are just like kind of afraid of being seen as racist in like administration office or like by the employers, right? Very often you know that you can get sued because of this, which means that on both sides of the house, there's still some racism, but there's still some counterbalance to that. And I'm not seeing how these criminal records are making any dent on that regard. Second thing that I point out is police needs to get like more precise information because they need to respond accordingly. I'm not sure why knowing more information is going to mean that you're going to like respond accordingly, right? It very often means that you're going to overblow the like danger that this person possesses exactly because they have a record, even if maybe they have been only like say a sentence for something which is like a drug bust 10 years ago, right? But this is very often when police actually go to the field, very often they have no time to ask for the record prior to it, right? If you're in a fight or if there's like a robbery, policemen very often go there without asking for any record prior because they're just like, no time for that. Okay, let's deal with all. And they say, I do like a couple of things. A, they say like deterrence doesn't happen now. And as you point out, you're still afraid of going to jail and like losing your money and losing your friends, right? B, very often people still reoffend because of like economic hardships, or like C, very often because of mental illness, right? So some deterrence is still here. But B, I'm not sure how social stigma is something which is creating a deterrence. Why your employer is not employing you is something which is a very huge deterrence on their side, right? I do believe this is something that very often pushes you to crime even more. Second thing that I point out is very often, but you cannot not appeal to your sentence, right? A, very often you can because this is like a justice proceeding, but B, very often, look, on our side, you cannot appeal to the social stigma and the social punishment that you are going to get, right? And I do believe this is so awful, right? And I do believe that very often you're not going to know how long the punishment is going to last. Like what are the rules of the social punishment that you're going to get, right? And I do believe this is far worse on our side. Third thing that I point out is it doesn't change like about rehabilitation because you're still a danger to society. Sometimes you are, but sometimes you're also not. Right? Very often, if you have been arrested for 5 grams of coke, I'm not seeing how you're a huge threat to the society, right? And by letting you out of jail and everyone forgetting about it, you're not a huge threat. Secondly, notice that very often people get back to crime for other reasons, right? But it very often can be solved with other stuff, for example, like discrimination laws or like more welfare, etc. And I do believe that this kind of comes as a wash. And I do believe this is also the reason that OG loses, because I do also agree with OO when they say that a lot of the issues about like the minority community like getting fucked by this is something which we can solve on our side by like different stuff and like different mechanisms. Oh no, putting environment. Look, I do agree that like Francesca mentioned victims in like 30 seconds, but I don't think this is sufficient to explain the very complex mechanism that Georgia actually provided to you, right? He explained to you why like very often you cannot get help anywhere else, right? B, he very often explained why we as a state have a specific duty towards you, right? And to prioritize you over anything else that there's that like there is in the justice system. C, very often, as George pointed out, this is important because it takes like it gives back to you your agency to control your life and how you're going to feel about stuff. And I do believe this is immensely important. And finally, on the principle, they just said, oh, this is disproportionate. I do believe that Georgia gave you two mechanisms here. They that very often you not know what your punishment is going to be, and this is very often unjust because you don't know how people are going to treat you, and then very often you cannot appeal to your punishment, and this is something which is far worse than maybe punishment being slightly disproportionate, right? Very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I'm happy to call upon the opposition whip to close out the debate. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me? Three clashes in this debate. Number one, what happens to victims? Number two, what happens to released prisoners and communities in which there are a lot of released prisoners? And number three, the impacts on future crimes. I can't remember the last time I did this, but this is actually an organized enough debate that rebuttal will be integrated. I will be flagging it though, so note that. And we'll start with victims because that's where CG comes, and already in the beginning of their extension, they weigh this as the most important part of the debate. But here's the problem. They tell you, oh, you no longer have a memory of it. But this is the POI I already asked opening. If my neck is broken, as happens in a physical assault, or my hippocampus is smaller because I am suffering PTSD, as happens in cases of trauma, that is not something that can simply be reversed. Right? We also give you the mechanistic reasons for this. And in addition to the fact that we get this from OG and we get it from the motion, we also prove it to you logically, because a 3-year-old who suffered a horrific sexual assault does not remember the assaulter, does not remember not only the perpetrator, but also the situation and the event, nevertheless suffers from PTSD, nevertheless has been greatly harmed by all of these experiences. So there we have CG telling us, look, even if you know, what does it help, right? Because you need years of therapy. First of all, we don't understand why they claim years of therapy are ineffective. We think if that is what actually solves the problem, PTSD is a lot worse than therapy. We think the effects of many of these crimes are horrific. So great, go to therapy. Also, right, as my partner told you, by the motion, you know at least for a certain amount of time, meaning any of the immediate mental effects that trigger this are known simply because mechanistically the motion tells you this happens at a later point. That means that you have already suffered the harm that comes, even if they think it's only from knowing, which we've proven to you it isn't, right? We think at that point you have suffered the harms of feeling. Now, why is this not only horrific for victims, but comparatively worse on our part, right? Because our analysis tells you that you need to heal. The only way to heal is if society accepts what happens. That means being able to talk to people. That means you as the victim now knowing what it is that you're trying to get over, recognizing that the fact that you're terrified of any sort of sexual or romantic contact, the fact that you are terrified of dark alleyways comes from a source and you need to get therapy. That happens uniquely on our side, and the healing process can only happen if you know of what happens. That happens only on our side of the debate, right? Also, we think that the moment you can talk about it and you can start from here's what happened to me, you are years ahead in therapy of someone who has to deal with the PTSD of childhood where they don't even know what it is, right? We think if they think years of therapy are a waste, we completely disagree, but we think we save a lot of time by putting you at the stage where you recognize what it is that needs to be treated. And crucially, you do not feel alone in society. On their side, a victim is completely alone because not only is there no face to attribute the crime to, but there is no feeling of, oh, everyone knows I was raped. Everyone knows I was attacked, right? We think that is crucial to the healing process, and that disappears on their side. And by CG's metric of telling us that victims are the most important in this debate, we certainly think we have defeated them simply on this clash alone. But because there were other clashes in this debate, and we want to make sure we beat top half as well, let's move on to released prisoners in their communities. Because OG tells us, look, these people are less likely to be stuck in this cycle of crime. But it is crucial to note, as OO does a very good job of reminding them, all of this is entirely contingent on societal acceptance, right? They don't gain anything simply by telling us, oh, prisons might be better, because there needs to be a proof for why that happens on their side of the house and why this results in society seeing it that way, right? The only thing we really get is, oh, there's some sort of like political goodwill that everyone wants prisons to be better, right? We just don't see how that impacts any policy, especially when OO tells you there are already corporate interests, there are reasons to keep the prisons as they are, and we haven't gotten any prison reforms under this motion, so we assume it's fairly similar. But now, what do we add to you on this debate, on this clash? Because right? OO already tells you that it may not work, but we tell you why it is so much worse. The way that some people make it out of the cycle of crime and poverty today is because they have some neighbors who do better, some members of their community whom they know, with whom they interact, are able to get out, can offer them jobs, can offer them guidance, support, help, etc. All of that disappears once this motion is passed. Why? Because today, maybe there are racists who don't like hiring members of minority groups. But now, when you cannot check a prison record, right, we think it's true. There are some people who really don't care and will hire anyone. There are some people who are racist and don't hire minorities regardless. That's not the debate, and we think opening spent way too much time on those groups. We talk to you about the majority here, the major group that says, look, I'm fine with hiring Black people. I do not want to hire criminals. Statistically, right, in America, a third of Black males age 30 and up have a prison record. If I can't know and I see this man is Black and has tattoos, we think even people who aren't inherently racist are likely to say, hey, I am not willing to hire him. At that point, right, OO already gives you part of this in a rebuttal where they say the debate may be symmetrical, but we tell you so much more. It's not symmetrical because on our part, there is no one from this community, the 2/3 who are not released criminals and who frankly are more important in this debate because this is not a product of their own actions. They have done nothing to deserve mistreatment. They will now not be hired, right? And what we give you in addition to this is we tell you, oh, not only does this happen, but police do it too. And this is completely new, which is police are also involved in this racial profiling. Why? Because police now say, hey, look, this call is coming from a violent community. I don't have information, right? I therefore assume, right, and it's not always a call where immediately you can't look up the records. There are plenty of cases where I know who I'm arresting, but if I don't know in advance who this person is, I am very likely to say, I have to check every Black person, stop and frisk, whatever it is. We think that's dangerous. POI, opening.
Future victims are more important than current victims because we can prevent future victims from going through trauma in the first place.
Okay.
My earlier POI showed
so
that we prevent future victims more than.
So even now you're telling us, okay, this is something you analyzed in a POI. It's an interesting weighing to do in a whip speech for a first house speaker. But now, if you want to do that, so let's talk about future crimes, because that's the third clash, where OG tells us that these specific people are less likely to be stuck in that cycle of crime. We don't even think that that makes much of a difference because OO already tells you, yeah, but there are other future crimes being committed by other people. So if the question is what happens to society, we think police losing these abilities is not a good thing for them, right? Because police now cannot track all these things they need. And critically, when police rely on the type of metadata that they told us police will be using, at that point, police are much more likely to be racist and assume bad things about members of minority groups, which is harmful even to those who didn't commit crimes. But here we also tell you critically that public help is important, and we lose that for a couple of reasons. A, the sex offender registry is public because we need the public to be aware in order to prevent these traumatic crimes. B, there are specific parole officers, ankle monitors. There is the list of people who cannot buy guns, which now gun sellers don't have access to. We think society is critical, and only we bring you why society needs to help prevent crimes. For all of these reasons, please oppose the motion.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech and indeed the entire debate. I invite you to virtually shake hands and leave this breakout room, please. Feel free to reach out to me after the break is announced via Facebook and or Discord or whatever way you figure out to reach out to me. And the rest of the judges, I imagine as well, are happy to give you results and feedback at that point. Have a great rest of the tournament.
Thank you.
Thank you.